Hello, and welcome to episode 108 of The Ethical Life, a place where each week we talk about the intersection of ethics and modern life. I'm Scott Rada, social media manager for Lee Enterprises, and I am joined as always by Rick Kyte, who is the head of the Ethics Institute at Viterbo University in La Crosse, Wisconsin. Hello, Rick.
Hi, Scott.
Earlier this month, ESPN reported that 11,000 runners were disqualified after they were found to have cut at least part of the 26.2-mile course at a marathon in Mexico City. They weren't running for big cash prizes, but that didn't stop about a third of runners from what sounds like cheating. When I think of people cheating, Rick, it's often for some financial gain. But in this case, the motivation is different and, honestly, to me, a bit puzzling. What do you think is behind this?
Cheating is so complex, and I think you have to look. One is motivation. Why do people do it? And then also, like, what are the things that deter cheating? Like, first of all, like the things that would have deterred this is if people are pretty sure that they might get caught, or if it's really hard to do, then you're not going to have 11,000 people doing it. So one of the things that leads to this is obviously it was quite easy to cheat, and people didn't think they would get caught.
Well, maybe the second part's more true. I mean, apparently they did get caught, though.
They did get caught, but they didn't think they would.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
That's the thing. And the other thing is, if there's a perception that everybody else is doing it, and this goes partly to motivation. If you're in a competition and you think that everybody else is cheating, then cheating in the same way is, for many people in their minds, they're just leveling the playing field. They're not really cheating. They're just making it fair again by doing the same thing everybody else is doing to get ahead.
And we heard some of those discussions, and I'm sure it's in other sports as well, but I'm more familiar with baseball in the 90s when performance-enhancing drugs, especially steroids, were being used so heavily, and many players felt, like you just said, to keep things fair, they had to do it as well. But again, the difference, though, is that they did that because being a professional ball player is a really well-paying position. And I'm not saying I excuse that behavior. I'm not saying I excuse people who swindle banks or other folks out of money, but it seems like the motivation here is to, say you ran a marathon in like a better than average amount of time. Seems like your only person who should be impressed by that is you and like the 5 people closest to you.
But then ask, like, why do people run a marathon anyway? I mean, if you're doing it for fitness and to improve yourself and to test yourself and so forth, well, the training for a marathon accomplishes all your goals. The race itself doesn't really do anything. So then why do the race? Mm-hmm. Well, the race is where you really pit yourself against others in a public setting. And it turns out many of the studies that have been done on cheating say that it's the head-to-head competition that drives much of the cheating. People aren't going to lie to themselves about their training times, right? But when they're in a head-to-head competition, they're going to try to outdo the people around them. For some reason, I think that is what drives it. And paradoxically, this is what I found really interesting about some of these cheating studies. The people who had an expectation of winning, like if they'd won in the past or they'd performed very well in the past, they're more likely to cheat than people who thought they weren't going to do very well. So I would guess you might think that in this marathon race, it's a lot of the worst runners are going to be more likely to cheat. But it turns out in a setting like that, it's a lot of the better runners that are more inclined to cheat because they have an expectation that they're going to do really well and they want to ensure that they do.
So, like, that story was surprising to me, and you sent that to me, and I'm like, well, that's a lot of people, and I don't know much about Mexican City marathons, but that seems like a pretty big stage, and that really surprised me. Then you sent me a story from Wired magazine that is older story, actually, back from 2020, but it was one of the most fascinating things I had read. And it was about a gentleman named Derek Murphy, who has like a real job, but he has also took on a sort of part-time gig where he investigates runners' times who seem suspicious. And he prides himself on going after and identifying people at marathons, I think, worldwide. I mean, at least certainly the more prestigious ones, and looking at times that just don't quite make sense compared to what they've run in the past. And there's cameras set up periodically along the race to make sure everybody crosses certain points. And he studied some of this, and he would go out and really kind of publicly on this website question people after doing what seemed to me to be a lot of due diligence here of saying, I think this person or that person is not being honest with us. And as the story unfolds, he looks closely into a 7-year-old physician named Frank Meza, who he makes these similar allegations against, and they have a bit of a back and forth, and I won't entirely spoil the ending of the story, but it does not end well for Frank. I mean, I guess, I don't know, maybe to talk about this in its totality, we should spoil the ending, that Frank commits suicide. And I think the story mostly puts the investigator, Derek Murphy, in a pretty positive light, but it also, just like I was curious about those 3,000 people who got disqualified from the Mexican City Marathon and what motivated them to do that, I'm also curious what motivates someone like Derek Murphy to devote so much time and attention, and clearly he gets a great deal of pushback from people in the running community for what they think are sometimes making unfair allegations. His motivation I find interesting as well. What were your thoughts when you read through that?
I found it fascinating because I don't know that much about running marathons. I've never run.
Full disclosure, we never have, neither of us have run a marathon.
I found it really interesting just as a story about the steps he would take to discover the cheaters, and then Frank would come back with different kinds of lies he would make up to explain away the apparent anomalies. Like he would have regular times in between checkpoints, and then there'd be one segment of the race in which he ran much faster, right? And then he would have some explanation for why he ran faster in that time, but then there would be some camera evidence showing him ducking into an alley, right? And which would explain how he could cut off a certain segment of the race, and that would correspond with cutting off that much time from his running. And so that I found that really fascinating. I was having real trouble understanding, but why are people doing it? Like, why cheat in something like a marathon unless you're cheating to win, to win the whole race?
And I don't think that was ever uncovered in any of the things I've read, right?
Right. Yeah. If there's no financial gain, you're not getting the cash prize or something like that. But I think this boasting privilege of saying, for my age group, I performed in the top 10 or whatever it happens to be, I did really well. I think that's enough of an incentive for some people to cheat, and turns out to be the case for somebody like Frank.
Just to stay on that story for a second, Derek Murphy, unlike us, was a runner, and I think if I remember right, had run a few marathons in his past, so he had a closer connection to the sport than we do.
Yes.
I'm guessing any runner who runs some of these middle and higher level races may hear whispers about allegations about people cheating, but he really acted on that and again devoted so much time and attention and energy to this. I would imagine, I don't know, obviously Derek, but I would imagine some people around him were kind of saying, at what point does this public service you're doing sort of morph into an obsession?
Well, it might. I mean, any kind of, it sounds like this is a hobby.
Yeah.
And for any of us, if you kind of get good at doing a hobby, you're able to do it well, and it can become pretty interesting. So I just see it as that. He knows something about marathons. He knows how to use the technology to discover things. And I think he probably also thinks he's providing real service because, as somebody who's been a runner himself, when you enter into one of these competitions and you're not cheating, you're relying on the integrity of everybody else in the race to know actually how are you doing relative to anybody else. And so if you have quite a few cheaters, what's the point of even running in the race?
But one of your hobbies we've talked about before is woodworking.
Yep.
And I don't know this, but I'm guessing there are few, if any, pieces you have made that you've sold for profit. Am I correct?
Yeah, I don't sell any of it.
That's not what you do. But at no point in your woodworking hobby are you like harming anyone, right? I mean, I can't imagine how that would even be the case. But again, I don't want to, for a second, say I think Derek Murphy was maybe doing anything wrong, but he had to know that he is going to expose people to criticism and ridicule and shame for outing them in this way. To me, that's a different calculus than like what your hobby is,
Yep.
which is just making things because you enjoy it and these little creations for you and your family. Should those the outcome of his investigation, should he be thinking about that, or should he just say, no, I'm fighting the good fight and I'm going to expose this and let the chips fall where they may?
Yeah, I don't think he's harming anybody. I mean, he certainly, when he outs somebody for cheating, they don't like it.
Sure.
And they may suffer depression or anxiety and all these things, but he's not causing that harm. They caused the harm by cheating. I mean, he's not making out any false allegations. I mean,
Yeah, he seems to be very careful before.
He's being very careful, and he's getting the evidence, and he's giving people a chance to respond. When he finds some discrepancies in the times and so forth, he's letting people know before he makes any allegations. The harm is done by the person who commits the cheating, because they're signing up and pledging that they're going to abide by the rules, and they don't do it. They're bringing all that distress upon themselves, because all that this cheating sleuth is doing is bringing it out into the open, right? And if somebody brings my actions out into the open, sheds light on it, I can't complain that they're causing me harm.
And I think what you're saying here, too, is it's not like these people are doing something that doesn't have an effect on others, right? Like if they were just, I'm sure he wouldn't do this, but if they were just like running through their neighborhood and every day telling their friends that they ran 10 miles when they really ran 5, I mean, that's different because they're not part of an organized, structured competition, right?
Right. No, this is a public activity.
Yes, yeah,
right?
That's where the difference is.
And the whole point of participating in a race is participating in a public competition. So nobody's exposing private behavior.
Yeah.
He's exposing behavior that people want to keep private, I guess you could say. But you don't get that choice. When you sign up for a public competition, you don't get the choice to say, yeah, but part of my public competition I'm going to keep private. Like, no, that's not what you're doing. You're saying, yeah, I'm going to participate in this race on the same terms as everybody else. And then if you don't do it, you deserve to be exposed. I don't think he's doing anything wrong with this exposure, despite, it can cause great distress for the people who are cheating. Well, they shouldn't cheat.
And so I was trying to, and I never quite found this when I was poking around online, but I was trying to find out what type of cheating seems to be looked at by the majority of people as sort of okay. And I should first say that when you do search online for cheating, what often comes up is marital infidelity, and that's probably a little different than what we're going to be talking about today, although I guess we'll see. You know, one thing that did come up was cheating on taxes, and I think we talked about this a little bit on the show, but I think it's worth talking about again, is that it seems to be, and that's not only cheating, like the people in Mexico City were, that's actually a crime. I mean, I don't think anything that happened in Mexico City, there's an ethical problem there. I don't think there's a crime there. If you're cheating on your taxes, be it federal or state, that's cheating, and oh, by the way, it's a crime. But it does seem like that's something that a lot of people seem a little too comfortable with, because well, the government spends money poorly and they're run by a bunch of crooks anyway, and all these sort of excuses to excuse your bad behavior. Do you kind of agree with that premise?
Yeah, I do. And I think cheating is the wrong word. It's lying and it's stealing, right? Because when you're a citizen of a country or resident of a state or a community, and you agree to abide by certain kinds of rules, and then you lie about how those rules apply to you, but you're still taking advantage of all the services, all the things those taxes pay for. You still get the benefit from them, but you aren't paying your fair share. That's theft. It's also what sometimes called the free rider problem in ethics. Like it costs a certain amount to keep the buses running, but if you find a way of not paying your bus fare, you are a free rider, right? That's theft.
Or just like, and again, that, whether you're a bus rider or whether you're at a retail store, those places have to increase their cost to others to make up for the folks who don't do what they're supposed to do.
Absolutely. And that certainly happens with taxes. I mean, we pay more in taxes because there are so many people who don't pay what they owe in taxes. If everybody paid their fair amount, right, our taxes would be lower. So those people who are so-called cheating on their taxes are actually making the rest of us who aren't cheating pay more money. That's stealing from us. So I think we should call it what it is. I think we should call it lying and theft. And cheating is a euphemism, because cheating, we tend to think, well, that's taking unfair advantage in a competition. That's what cheating is. Well, paying your taxes isn't a competition. And it's not just that you win at the game against, in some competition where there really aren't any losers. You're actually stealing. And so that's what we should call it. I find it really interesting when we start looking at things like lying, theft, cheating, different forms of dishonesty or unethical behavior. There's a number of studies that have been done that show that, first of all, as I mentioned, people who are more accustomed to winning find it easier to justify cheating than those who are accustomed to losing. But that also transfers to wealth, kind of winning in the game of life. It turns out richer people are more likely to file false tax claims than poor people do, right? So the people who can most afford their taxes are more likely to cheat on their taxes.
And may have more clever and likely illegal ways to hide or obfuscate some of those, the reporting that's required.
Yeah, they're gonna have more means to do it, because the taxes get complex, and so with more complexity, there's more opportunities. But also, what we find out from a number of studies is that people who have higher incomes are more likely to lie in negotiations. They're more likely to take valued goods from other people, and they're more likely to excuse unethical conduct in businesses. So generally, people at lower income levels tend to be more honest and more fair and more considerate of the rules and other people. And you would think it would be the other way around, right? Because like the people at lower income levels need the resources more, but that's not the case. So it turns out when things are structured like a competition, people who are used to winning are more likely to justify, to rationalize in their heads why taking advantage of somebody else is okay, than people who are used to losing. And that's it. Just like, so we're better off not structuring things as competitions, is how it turns out.
And another thing that is probably a place where a lot of people have cheated in their lives is in the classroom. And you spend a lot of time in classrooms, and I'm sure it happens at all levels, whether you're in elementary school or whether you're in college. And I'm sure in your many years as a professor, you've come across this. I guess two questions. One, what do people, when confronted with that, typically say? was their reason? And two, have you noticed any changes in, whether it's more common than it used to be, less common than it used to be, whether people feel differently about it? And I'm just curious, over your few decades in the classroom, if you've seen any changes there.
No, I haven't really seen any changes. There's a big difference. In different kinds of disciplines, we have different ways in which we do evaluations and different ways of grading. So, for example, I never grade on a curve, but I've been a teaching assistant. And when I was at Johns Hopkins for a number of years, I was a teaching assistant in a logic class that was like a lot of students, and there was both quizzes and exams, and everything was on a curve. So, the top 10% of class got one grade, and then the next 10%, and the next 10%. And so you were really in a competition with everybody else. And it turns out when you grade on a curve like that, you're much more likely to get cheating for people that try to move up in the level.
Because you're competing with everybody sitting around you.
You're competing with everybody else. And if there's a perception that other people are cheating, then by cheating, what you're doing is you're making things fair for yourself, because otherwise they're taking advantage of you, right? And so that's how that tends to get justified. And so in those kinds of situations, that's what people would say. They would defend their actions by saying, well, I know this person who are also cheating, and I didn't want to be the sucker. So I never grade on a curve, and I also tend to assign a lot of papers because of, the sorts of things that I teach. And so where I get cheating is plagiarism.
Yeah.
Now, prior to AI coming along, that's a whole nother beast. But prior to that, I could usually tell when people had plagiarized something, because it tended to be students who, many times foreign students who were having trouble with the language anyway, so they felt themselves at a disadvantage. And sometimes in which they had a culture in which they really didn't understand what's wrong with taking things from other sources without proper attribution. Oftentimes when I'd confront a student with plagiarism, especially if they were foreign students, they would be kind of shocked. I mean, despite all, like, warnings in the syllabus and things, students famously don't read the syllabus anyway. And so you would point this out and they would be really surprised because they're coming from different cultural norms. But then I've had other students who just talk about they were really overwhelmed, too much work, and all this stuff. And what I generally do, unless I've had repeated incidents of plagiarism, I give students an opportunity to rewrite the paper, because if they really were confused or they come in from a different background or something, I want to see their best work, and I want them to learn something from the class. And what happens is, I would say 2 out of 3 times, students will be grateful for that, and then they'll work really hard and actually turn in their own work that's pretty decent. And I get others who just blow it off, and so they're just going to fail, right? If they're going to cheat and then they're not actually going to submit their own work and show that they can do it, they're going to end up failing the class.
We started off by talking about runners in Mexico City who didn't seem to have much of a obvious motivation to cheat, but yet they did. I would imagine the majority of your students are typical college students who are 18 to 23, but I'm also sure you have some alternative students, older students, maybe people who are doing this later in life, or they just really want to explore the topic more and is of interest to them. Are they, my gut reaction would be they would be less likely to do this because they aren't trying to turn that GPA into a marketable tool to get them a better job. They're just there because they want to be there. Is that hunch probably correct?
Yeah, I tend to have no problems with cheating from older students who are coming back into the classroom to improve themselves.
Yeah.
They're holding themselves to a certain kind of standard. In fact, the most common concern I get from them is they're just worried that they're not doing good enough work. Like they're really they're really concerned with kind of how they appear and whether they're up to the task. And so they tend to be really nervous, especially, if they're coming back to the college classroom after 20 years, they tend to be pretty nervous. They're intimidated by the expectation and the atmosphere. But it's not a problem with cheating. Where I run into cheating most are, as I said, I have some like foreign students who, like, the cultural norms might be different and it just takes a little while. And as they get more comfortable with the language, it gets easier for them to do the work. The other is student athletes who are sometimes in the class just because they have to maintain eligibility, but they really don't have any interest in learning the subject. They're going to do whatever they can to just stay. Now, this is not true of all student athletes. It's just like where I've run into problems kind of over the years, and it's where it's a little bit more predictable, is student athletes who don't want to be in the classroom anyway. They're only there because they want to participate in sports.
So I'm going to tell a story that'll make me sound bad, but I'll tell it anyway. I was in high school, and I took a chemistry class. And I think objectively, the teacher in my high school chemistry class was not a good teacher. He did not connect well with students. I think he was a chemistry whiz. I'm also 100% certain he was not a great teacher. And those are two different skills. I had walked into that class with virtually no knowledge about chemistry. I don't know, maybe some of my fellow students did. And I did not pick up a lot. And there were times where, and there were a couple of us in the back of the room who were all, I made a couple of good friends in that class, believe it or not, but who were not, who did take advantage of the one smart kid ahead of us who walked into that class knowing everything about chemistry and could just answer the questions because he was a big nerd. If you would have asked me at that time what was my reasoning for doing it, I would hope I would have said, and again, this isn't a great excuse, is that he's a pretty terrible teacher. From a ethical standpoint, that's just not like a great response, I realize. But it does seem like that in this particular case, I would just wonder if you see more cheating in classes, no matter what the level, where teachers are just not connecting with students and getting the information out, and the students don't feel like they want to try real hard for this lousy teacher, and B are just struggling and to learn it anyway and find a way out. Does that sort of ring true to your experience, that sometimes you get a lousy teacher who I don't want to say it doesn't encourage such behavior, but maybe tacitly promotes such behavior?
Yes, I think, you end up not having any, first of all, you don't have any loyalty to such a teacher,
correct,
right, to do your best. And you also have a feeling that it doesn't matter if you try really hard, how you're being evaluated doesn't have any connection with your effort, right? With a bad teacher, you're not learning from the teacher anyway, right? And so I think, that's absolutely right. And also a lot of times the bad teachers are kind of oblivious to the cheating, because just as they aren't taking care with preparing their lessons, they also aren't making sure that people aren't cheating. They're not invested in the class.
And just to give one other example from the class, and this was not me, but he one time gave a 10-point quiz. And he said, take the quiz and then turn it in at the front of the room. And by the way, I'll leave the answer key up there as well. So when you turn it in, you can see how well you did. So again, not me, but some guy goes up there, and I think it was just, multiple choice, A, B, C, D. And this teacher is always in the back of the room at his desk, head down, doing goodness knows what. So he goes up there, sees the teacher's not paying attention, grabs his eraser, and starts changing a few of the answers to match the answer key up there. And so, I don't know if the teacher cleared his throat, but everybody looked and saw that the teacher saw what was going on. We're like, oh my gosh, what is going to happen? What will be the result of this? So the next day, the papers got handed back. And this particular student, of course, had all the right answers. It was 10. He had all 10 correct. At the time, and I'm not making this up, at the top of the page, it said, 9 out of 10, -1, I saw you cheating.
Oh, no. -1. That's every incentive to keep doing it.
Well, that may be true. But
apparently thought he'd only cheated on one.
I guess.
Or something.
I guess. But that was his true response to that, the one time that in that classroom that I think he caught someone.
Well, I have a funny cheating story from high school, too, because when I was in 10th grade, the history teacher for the school left unexpectedly, and they didn't have time to hire a new history teacher. So our gym teacher, Mr. Smith, who had taught history, I guess, 30 years before or something, was recruited to teach this world history class.
I bet he was thrilled.
He didn't want to be there, and he really didn't know anything about world history. And so he would pretty much read from the textbook, and then we would get weekly quizzes. Well, he used to stand at, put his book or his notes on one of those, those carts that had overhead projectors, so they're up fairly high. He had one of those at the front of the classroom, and he would teach from that. And it was pushed up against one of the desks at the front row. Now, my buddy Bob sat at the desk that projector butted right up to that projector. So during these quizzes, Bob would lean his history book up against the overhead projector. Mr. Smith, standing on the other side, wouldn't see it. And as the questions were read out that we were supposed to answer, he would just page through so he could find it.
Find the year, find the president, or whatever the case might be.
So here is the whole class watching Bob cheat on the quizzes, and Mr. Smith is just oblivious. And after a couple times, he's praising Bob for getting correct scores. Well, then other people are starting to slide their books underneath their desk, right? And so all these different strategies for cheating become common throughout the classroom. Well, what happens is the scores start going up and up and up. So Mr. Smith thinks he has to make these quizzes harder. So pretty soon he's asking questions about things in the footnotes of this book that are like completely unnecessary to know. And, I'm the ethics kid. I'm trying not to cheat at all. I'm getting like out of 10, I'm getting 1s and 2s on these quizzes. He finally found towards the end of the semester, discovered that Bob was cheating, but again, apparently thought he just did it on that one. So there was no punishment for it. It is a good illustration of the way in which the norms will change depending on the circumstances. If other people, like in the competition for grades in a class like this, if they think that everybody else is cheating, then they pretty soon think, look, there's nothing wrong with me. I'm not a cheater for cheating. I'm just protecting myself.
And go back to how we started this episode in Mexico City, where they estimate that a third of the racers cheated. Well, again, you and I have not run a marathon, but I think we have a sense that if a third of the people suddenly disappeared and reappeared and disappeared and reappeared throughout the race, you will notice. And just like it was, Bob's textbook was visible to the rest of the class, so is the case when this guy just shows up barely winded at mile 22.
Yep.
So it does sort of give that tacit permission.
And if you're a racer and you're accustomed to, say, running in the top third, say, of a marathon, and there's not that many people are passing you, but you find yourself finally at the very end of the race, and you got to know there's something suspicious going on, right? I mean, you're going to know if you're a regular runner at these events. I'm sure that's played a big role in the cheating at this particular marathon. Is that in previous years, this cheating took place, and so it came to be known as a marathon in which a lot of the runners cheated. And so it was easy for people who were like otherwise honest to justify the behavior by saying they weren't really cheating. They were just protecting their position in the race.
We end each show by tackling an ethical dilemma. And Rick, what is your question for me?
Scott, let's say that you go to a nice restaurant, you're sitting having a dinner with your partner, and a family comes along, sits down next to you, and it's a couple with a young child, say like a 3-year-old child, and the child is noisy, obviously having a bad day, whining, behaving really badly. It's getting up occasionally, running around the restaurant, especially around your table, making a mess with food, but just being really disruptive. It's completely destroying the evening that you're having. And when you look over to the parents, they're just oblivious. They're not paying any attention to this 3-year-old. They don't seem to be affected by it at all. They're just completely engrossed in the conversation that they're having with one another. What do you do about that?
I have an important question before I answer.
Yep.
Is this nice restaurant where I'm sitting in my hometown, or am I on vacation somewhere where, like I was in Austin, Texas last week? Where am I?
Yep. Let's say you're on vacation.
That really changes things.
Why is that?
Because we live in a town of, our metro area is 100,000 people. Not that, so there's no way we know everybody, but it does sometimes feel like that when you're out. And it's amazing how when you're out somewhere, how often, and I'm sure you find this too, how often you run into somebody you know. And because of that, I don't know, is that person, are those the parents friends of a friend? Are they a neighbor I don't know about? All these things. I don't want to be the jerk if this is someone who I'm going to have to interact with. Like we hire someone new at work, and oh, by the way, that's the guy, a month ago I, gave a dirty look to at the restaurant. So I would be much more restrained if it were in my hometown. But if I'm in this particular case, Austin, Texas, where I may go back to visit, but I likely will have no other connection there the rest of my life, I feel like a lot more freedom, because I in that case, I think I don't know exactly how I would do it, and I would hope I would do it in a clever and direct way, but say to them, why do you think this is okay? And because I guess in those situations, assuming we're not the only two people in the restaurant or the only two tables in the restaurant, that everyone else around you is feeling the same way. And so you do have some sort of strength in numbers. But I also find it odd when in those situations, nobody ever feels like they can stand up. And maybe it's because they feel like me, because they don't want to have that accidentally be their next door neighbor one day. So I think I would feel empowered that I'm not going to cause a scene, but I think especially as they were leaving, or if I happen to leave before them, is walk over and say, just so you know, your kid was being a little kid, and that's normal, but you were doing a terrible job as parents keeping them in line, and I promise you, everybody within 6 tables of you noticed. And I may be the only person saying something, but you probably made this night less enjoyable for a dozen people here, and you should just know that.
Would you say it that tactfully? I mean, it's direct, but also you seem pretty measured in your words.
I would hope so. I would hope so. I wouldn't want to get angry at them, because I don't want to cause a bigger scene than the child is. I would hope I would say it in a way where it would even be heard beyond the table where these parents are sitting. I think I would want to take a deep breath and say, okay, just stay calm. But I don't know what is gained by ignoring that, unless, back to my first point, if I may stumble across these people someday, then that little interaction is not worth the awkwardness that may come of a future relationship that may happen. What kind of crystallizes this for me was something that happened many, many, many years ago. I was by myself in a large department store in a nearby large city. And for some reason, I was walking through the fine china department. And, not even many department stores have fine china departments back then, but this one did. And it was a slow weekday. I found myself there. And there was this older woman who just had an air of her, money and privilege, walks up to a young man who at the time was probably about my age, because I was probably in my 20s, and says to him, "Excuse me, could you please find someone who could help me with the china?" And this young man stands up and says, how can I help? What question can I answer? Just like he should.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, you can help me by finding someone who knows what they're talking about. So, of course, he does exactly what he should do, and he goes over to the phone and calls up the manager of the department or someone, whoever this is that he thinks could help. So I kind of am, and I'm seeing all of this, and he's sort of standing awkwardly waiting for the manager to show up. And knowing I'm in a city where I don't know anybody and likely won't have any interactions, I walk up to the woman and say, excuse me, are you from, I won't name the city, but are you from a particular city, a suburb of this larger town? And she's like, no. I'm like, oh, that surprises me, but that's where all the old bitchy women live. And of course I said it, and the clerk next to me was like, basically I'm like, hey, I got your back here. And she didn't think it was, and I don't know if she learned a lesson from that. She probably didn't. Maybe she did. But it made me feel good, and it certainly made the young man who was working there feel good. Because, of course, he can't say that thing because he's risking his job. I'm risking nothing. Yeah. I mean, there's no risk I'm taking.
So you're standing up for him. Of course, you're confirming her that whatever negative judgment she had about this sales clerk, you're kind of confirming it for the whole generation.
That all young men in their 20s at this point are jerks.
Yeah, and which is why she wants to deal with somebody who's older and knows what they're talking about.
And looks more like her or whatever. And that may be true. And that may be true. But I guess I would not have done that in the smaller town where we live in our shopping mall. I never would have done that.
Right.
For reasons we talked about. So I don't know if that gives you more insight into how I see these things. And I tried to keep calm and it was mostly just to see what the reaction would be from her. And I think people are sometimes caught off guard when they're called out for their bad behavior.
I find it fascinating that different kinds of parenting styles that you see in restaurants. And I think there's a different standard for behavior. If you're in a really nice place,
oh, sure.
You expect, like, if somebody's going to bring small children into a really nice restaurant, those better be kids who have some experience of how to behave in public and are held to that, so that then if they aren't behaving that way, they would leave because they're not going to disrupt other diners' experience. If you're at a McDonald's or something,
oh yeah,
like that's part of the
make
experience. You expect that, and that's no problem. And then there's a whole range of kind of places that are in between, right?
Yeah,
where you have a little more tolerance for little kids are going to have a bad days, and if you see parents like with a big family and lots of kids, yeah, some of them are going to be noisy. That's okay. And that's different from running all over the restaurant, right?
But I am really convinced, and I mean, I guess I only see what I see, but I am truly convinced that the problem you outline is so much less common than it was 10 years ago for one reason.
What is that?
iPads. There are so many times I've been to restaurants where I'll see kids of, and maybe 3's a little young, but like 5 or 6, where I'm like, oh, they're going to be squirrely and they're going to be, and again, this may not, it's great for me. It may not be great for other reasons, but their nose the entire time when they're not spooning food into their mouth is looking at the iPad, whether it's passively or playing some game, and they're happy and quiet. And the parents are enjoying their time. And so I think this situation happens a lot less than it used to.
That's interesting. I think you're probably right, which is like in a way unfortunate for those kids, because then that's one of the things that's really important is learning self-regulation, right? Yep. And we didn't take our kids out. Well, we didn't, when our kids were very young, we didn't go out to eat very much. Mm-hmm. We just couldn't afford it. But when we did go out to eat, and it was, it really didn't matter where it was, we impressed on our kids like what a privilege this was, and if they weren't on their best behavior, we would just leave. Mm-hmm. And we did that a few times. Mm-hmm. And sometimes kids are just really, they might be really hungry, they might be really tired, something's going on. And if you're a parent, you have small kids, you have to bring something to keep them occupied. Yeah. So we'd bring coloring books or things like that. It doesn't take too many times where like they have one of the kids has to go out in the car and sit in the car for the rest of the meal while the other kid gets to stay in the restaurant and eat something that they really want. That happens one time, and they are much better the next time. So it doesn't take, I think, a lot of parenting skill just to have kids behave a little bit better in public. So I think parents do need to know it. I think you're right about saying something to them, because they need to know that, like, it's not acceptable behavior on their part, not just their kids.
And of course, there's a slightly separate discussion about whether it even should be the customer's responsibility, whether it should be the waiter or the manager of the restaurant. And that's putting them in a trickier spot too.
Well, is there a situation like that where you would ask to be moved to a different table?
Oh, I mean, possibly. I mean, I used to make the joke back in, and this is, makes me sound old, but back in the days when there used to be smoking and non-smoking parts of the restaurant, and then we had only non-smoking restaurants, and I always thought that you should, when you come to the host stand, instead of them asking smoking or non-smoking, they should ask you kids or no kids and kind of segregate them into two separate sections. We've talked about this. You go to church regularly. I don't. And I think that's another place where kids, I think there's probably, as a child, at least when I was a child and my family went to church, that was a place where I always was sort of like on my best behavior for lots of reasons. But that's also a place where kids are supposed to go. And do you ever see kids of, in that 5-6-year-old range with iPads in church? Like in restaurants, that seems like borderline acceptable. I would think it might not be in churches, but I don't know.
No, I haven't seen it in churches, but I haven't gone to a lot of different churches.
Yeah.
In the church that I attend, there's a corner of what's called the sanctuary, the room where the services take place. There's a corner of it with a blanket and several toys and like books and toys and things like that. And then there's also an area kind of in the lobby just outside of the sanctuary that's a little like a reading area. What parents often do with really young kids is they'll just sit with the child like on the blanket with the toys, and they can play there. And then anybody who sits over on that part of the church, that's what they expect. There's going to be kids that are, kind of walking around and playing with toys. But I was at a wedding recently in another city, and there's a couple sitting right ahead of us that had a child that probably was about a year to year and a half years old. They're really young. And it was really nice because there's a lot of weddings now that exclude children.
Oh,
right. This would become a really kind of a more common thing, is that right on the wedding invitation, say "No children, please," or something like that. Yeah. So it was really nice to see a wedding with a young child, and of course, at that age, this little kid was smiley and happy, and standing on his chair and like looking at us, and we'd smile at him and wave, and and then he was occupied for about 20 minutes. And then he started to get a little fussy and didn't want to stay in his seat and so on. And the father just picks him up, and they were sitting kind of on the edge, just walks to the kind of the back of the service. And that was entirely appropriate. But I'm really glad to see events like this that are kind of public events and public ceremonies in which children are a part of it. I think that's really important for their upbringing.
Well, Rick, the next time you're out in public and you see a 5 or 6 or 7-year-old on his or her iPad, and sometimes they have headphones, right? Or like the earbuds listening to whatever is on the iPad. I think you should just assume that they're listening to the Ethical Life podcast.
Absolutely. What else would they be doing?
What else would they be doing? And we're imparting wisdom for these young children to grow into adults that will be filled full of ethical goodness, right?
It's never too early to practice your skills of analysis.
Absolutely true. And as a reminder for people of all ages listening to our show, the Ethical Life podcast is a production of Lee Enterprises. Please subscribe to the Ethical Life on Apple Podcasts, on Google Podcasts, or on Spotify. And be sure to check out Rick's column that's about ethics and can be found on all Lee newspaper websites. For Rick Kyte, I'm Scott Rada. Thank you for joining us.